Hello and welcome to Video Lecture 5A, Hypernorms in Action, the example of Hasbro. This is a very short lecture that continues the Video Lecture 4 treatment of hypernorms. There will be a good bit of review of the material on hypernorms from last week and some anticipation of material to come in Video Lecture 5B. But the core of the lecture is the very interesting case of the toy company Hasbro and its document, Global Business Ethics Principles, which is included in your Week 5 reading. The bulk of this lecture is taken from a presentation on global ethics I gave to the Brunel community recently, which explains the overlap with other lectures. But that lecture came out from, that presentation came out from my preparations for this class. So, the major question we face in this class is, what happens when organizational ethics goes global? A very common and understandable first response to this question is one of caution, or even skepticism. After all, different nations and cultures in different parts of the world often, in fact commonly, display a great deal of variety and many times disagreement in terms of what is morally acceptable behavior. A very common attitude is one of cultural relativism, the belief that what is morally right or wrong differs, and sometimes dramatically, from culture to culture. There are no absolute moral principles that apply across all cultures. However, the consensus of ethicists working on global ethics issues, in fact the consensus of ethicists in general, is that cultural relativism is a myth. Now let me try to convince you that cultural relativism is not true. In fact, that hardly anyone really believes it is. The toy industry giant Hasbro has published a list of global business ethics principles that they operate under in their international business dealings. These principles include a prohibition on forced labor and child labor, fairness in assignment of wages and benefits, ensuring workplace health and safety, communication on all principles and policies to employees and others affected by them, and many more. Now, I think it's safe to say that we all agree strongly with these principles. In fact, I would dare to say that we would consider it morally unacceptable for any business from any country to operate in violation of these principles. As soon as you make that judgment about any culture other than your own, then you have announced that you are not a cultural relativist. Cultural relativism is the denial of any universally applicable moral principles. So as soon as you acknowledge the existence of even one, you have denied the doctrine of cultural relativism. So, with a simple list of guidelines for organizational behavior, Hasbro has tricked us all into denying a very popular view. So, what does Hasbro know that we don't? We'll start our answer to this question with the seminal work of ethicists Thomas Donaldson and Thomas Dunfee. Donaldson and Dunfee have identified what they call core human values, or hypernorms. These are moral norms that, in Donaldson's words, constitute the, quote, absolute moral threshold over which no moral decision can cross. Donaldson offers as examples of these core values or hypernorms the respect for human dignity, the respect for human rights, and good citizenship. Now, he does not claim this list is exhaustive, but it is certainly enough to be illustrative and to engender significant dialogue, none of which we have time for in the present. I want to compare the work of Donaldson and Dunfee with the work of another great business ethicist and perhaps my favorite pedagogue on the subject, Joseph Desjardins. Desjardins introduces what he calls the primary goods. He calls them this because he sees them to be necessary to achieve any other legitimate goods one might wish to attain in life. Desjardins identifies three such primary goods: autonomy, rationality, and mental, physical, and social well-being. Now, this concept of rationality requires just a quick explanation. This is access to any information necessary to make fully autonomous decisions. Okay, in order to be autonomous, you have to have the right kind of information that will enable you to make the decision that is in your best interest. And so access to that information is what Desjardins means by rationality. Think about the concept of informed voluntary consent. Rationality is the informed part. Autonomy is the voluntary part. Now, I believe that a combination of Donaldson's and Desjardins' lists is a great first approximation of a working list of hypernorms, moral standards that are appropriate to apply in any moral decision making in any culture in the world. The obviousness of these hypernorms is, I think, a big reason why I found this poster on the Rights 365 website. The heading reads, "Cultural relativism can never justify the violation of human rights." In other words, human rights is a universally applicable, absolute moral principle. In other words, cultural relativism is false. Now, Donaldson uses hypernorms as the starting point for his three guiding principles for global ethics. The first principle is respect for hypernorms. The second is respect for local traditions. Now, here Donaldson is talking about what he and Dunfee have called legitimate norms. These are cultural rules, customs, expectations, etc., that conflict with the moral sensibilities of other cultures, but are nonetheless consistent with the hypernorms. The third principle is an understanding that context matters in moral decision making. So, finally, let's go back to our examples of Hasbro's principles and answer our question: what does Hasbro know that we don't? I think that they are aware of the concept of hypernorms and are adopting policies that are, in their estimation, necessary for the upholding of these hypernorms. Prohibition of forced and child labor is in service to Donaldson's basic rights and Desjardins' well-being. Fairness in wages and benefits lives out the principles of human dignity and well-being. Ensure safety is a textbook case of care for well-being. Communication of principles and policies is necessitated by the concepts of autonomy and rationality. And on. Hasbro's principles adhere to the hypernorms and primary goods we have named. So what happens when organizational ethics goes global? This is what happens. Organizations identify, analyze, apply, and adjudicate the hypernorms in cross-cultural business activities.